Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everyone, my name is Himanshu and thank you so much for joining us in an exciting session today. I hope that you and your families are doing great. These truly are unprecedented times. As you know that the COVID-19 has pushed many businesses to the brink of extinction, their mere survival becoming difficult. Every day we are hearing news about the salary cuts, job losses and overall slowdown in the economic activity. Today, in this very special session by Mr. Nigel Penny, he will take us through three-stage planning and action program, which can act as a checklist for business leaders to chart their journey over the months and years ahead. I'll do a very quick introduction about Mr. Nigel Penny here. So here it goes. Mr. Nigel Penny is the founder and MD at NSP Strategy Facilitation Limited, a consultancy focused on sustainable future success through effective strategic management. He has carried out strategic assignments for leading corporations around the world. He is globally recognized and has developed strategy and performance measurement approaches for various industries, including telecom, retail, food, FinServ. I can go on and on and on about his decades of experience, but I think in the interest of time and keeping the overall intro very brief, I would now like to invite Mr. Nigel Penny to share his three-step guide for businesses to emerge stronger from the COVID-19 crisis. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Nigel Penny, and it's such a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much.
To all the members who will be joining us, you can always put in your questions and share your questions, and we'll try and take up as many as possible towards the end of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Himanshu. Thank you for that kind introduction. And good evening to all the participants in this webinar. My name is Nigel Penny. It's my great pleasure to have your time this evening. Thank you for giving me your time to present this webinar. I spend a lot of time in India when the circumstances are different. I've been traveling to and from India for over 20 years to work with many companies in India, and I've enjoyed every one of my trips. So it's very good to be talking to you this evening. And once again, just to reiterate what Himanshu said, I do hope that you and your families are all keeping safe in this difficult time. Our webinar tonight is really to introduce what I call a three-stage business guide for emerging stronger from COVID. What I want to try and do in the very brief time that we have together is to take you through a framework that recognizes the different stages that we will all face in our businesses as we emerge from COVID into whatever becomes the new normal. And I'm hoping that this framework will help you recognize and plan for the activities necessary in each of these three stages, which I call survive, envisage, and transition. And what I also hope is that if you apply this framework, it will help you increasingly move from the very necessary reactive mode that many of us have had to be in over the last few months as we've met these unprecedented challenges mode, where you can ensure that your organization emerges as what I would call one of the winners from this current difficult time. So with that in mind, let's step through some of the slides. First of all, let's talk about winners and losers. And this particular challenge that we all face at the moment will definitely lead to some companies winning and some companies losing. And some companies, even in the depth of this pandemic, some companies are actually finding opportunity and are actually growing as they are able to capitalize on a changed business landscape. Other companies are not doing so well, and we have to wonder why. And perhaps it's the framework that I introduced to you this evening that can be the difference between being a winner and a loser in this environment. So why are some companies winning? Why are some industries suffering badly? Well, let's be fair, there are some industries where there's very little that they can do about their current predicament. We think about the airline industry at the moment, which is facing huge challenges because people can't fly. And in circumstances like that, it's very, very difficult to see a scenario where that company can suddenly transform itself, shall we say. However, many of us are not in that situation. Many of us can actually do things today to transform our situation. So when we look at winners and losers, what do we see about the characteristics of winners and losers? Well, some of the companies that have become winners, what have they done? They've really rapidly seen the potential for new customers. You know, we've seen in online over the last few months, the growth, the massive growth of online, the massive growth of last mile delivery services. Seeing the potential for new customers is something that we should all look at during this time. And many of those winner companies have actually changed their delivery model. They've recognized that perhaps the old bricks and mortar delivery model that they've always successfully pursued in the past isn't going to work in the future. And they've changed that delivery model very, very quickly. In many instances, they've been smart in leveraging technology. They've actually turned technology rapidly to their advantage. And one of the also very important things, I think, is they've empowered their people. Now, I do a lot of work in the university segment, actually consulting to universities on their own management processes. And we've seen how universities have rapidly taken learning online. And one of the other things that we've seen in so many organizations is people tell me, we've been surprised how much our people have been able to achieve. Many of those people working remotely from the office, unsupervised, without the normal command and control processes that we've all loved for so many years. And given a bit of freedom, given a bit of relaxation, it's amazing what people have been able to achieve. So these are some of the characteristics, I think, of organizations that even in the last few months have been able to emerge as winners. Losers, on the other hand, I would suggest those are the companies that are just trying to ride out the storm. If we can survive long enough, it'll all come back to as it was before. And I don't think that's actually the case. Losers as well just focus on cutting costs. Now, cutting costs is key, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that can't be the long-term strategy to make you a winner. Cutting costs is about the first of the three stages in my program, which is survival. But if that's all you see as the route forward, I would suggest you're not going to emerge a winner. And also those companies that have allowed their service to slide, have not focused on actually service delivery. Those companies as well, I think, will ultimately turn out to be the losers in this very, very difficult period. So I want to introduce you to what I would see as a rigorous planning framework, which has three key stages. And I call these stages survive, envisage, and transition. Why do I say three stages? Well, I think it's very, very important that we recognize that this is a journey. And this journey does have these three key stages. And it's important that each stage is understood and has a different approach, and that we don't confuse the actions in each stage. This is what I've seen with some companies when they focused very much on survival, and they haven't understood that survival is just one of the components to actually emerging at the end of the day. So I want to try and introduce you to using this survive, envisage, transition framework to take your organization systematically through these three stages so that you emerge at the end of the day with a stronger winning organization. Let's talk about the first stage, because this is where most of us have been for the last few months. And the first stage is about survive. And clearly, if you don't survive, the other two stages make no sense at all. So we did have to, and we still have to take some drastic action. These are short to medium term actions, though. They will not take us into a new future. And most of us have already done this, and we're probably still doing this. We've obviously addressed things like cost reductions in the business. We've looked at people and asset lightening, and there's been some painful decisions that we've had to make on numbers of staff that we can keep. Spending freezes, of course, all non-discretionary expenditure. Let's put a stop to that. For many of us, we've had to work with financial institutions about loan rescheduling and rescheduling our corporate debt. And in some organizations, we've also spent time lobbying government to try and ensure that packages of support are available to take us through these very difficult few months. But survive is merely the first stage. You have to do it. I suspect that the very fact that you're on this call tonight means that your organization has done it. And so you'll continue to do it for a period of time, but survive is not the solution. Survive is just a short-term fix. However, even during survive, some organizations have been able to realize what I would call opportunistic business windfalls by creating new online marketplaces, as we talked about before. And we see the growth in companies like Amazon, who said gone through the roof, and various other online retailers particularly, who've been able to create an environment where this short-term survival period has actually led them to a new path of growth and maybe acquiring new customers as we've had to change our behaviors. But essentially, survive is about being reactive. It's not a proactive way to shape the future. And we now need to think about the next stage in this journey. Even as we struggle with some of the issues in survive, we need to start thinking about the next stage of the journey. And the next stage of the journey is Envisage. Envisage is all about planning what our future business will look like. It's about remapping the future course of our business. And it's about looking how we as an organization can be a shaper of the future rather than just a follower. And we need to plan carefully the journey stages. And I don't think it's too early to be doing that yet. We should be doing it absolutely now. So this is the core of the Envisage model that I want to try and introduce you to this evening. And we'll take each of these 4 stages of Envisage, these 4 steps of that Envisage component, and we'll talk through them in a little more detail on the slides that come. But let me just give you an idea, because I think this can be your checklist. This can be your business checklist for planning and marshalling your resources behind emerging as a winner. And I see there being 4 key elements to this. The first in that top right-hand quadrant is what I call business strategy recalibration. Our previous strategy may not work in the future. Markets will change. We are going to enter a new normal, and we don't know what that new normal is yet. So how can we plan for something that we don't understand? Well, as strategic planners, and I've been doing this type of work for 30 plus years, the future is always unknown. Now, today it may be somewhat even more unknown than in the past, but nonetheless, as business strategy people, we're used to uncertainty and we're used to planning for an uncertain future. But we certainly have to realize that it's not just about hunkering down for 12 months and hoping that things will resume as they were before. The first stage in Envisage is about understanding what is our current business strategy and how might that need to change. And there's a number of components of that I'll talk about in the following slides. The second piece of Envisage is what I call business continuity planning. One of the things that I think this pandemic has exposed in many organizations is that we haven't done a very good job on risk management in the past. We haven't identified strategic risks in our business, and we haven't looked at business continuity planning with a level of rigor that we should probably have done. So going forward, we're going to need to address what are the risks in our new strategy and how can we mitigate some of those risks and how can we create a business model that is more resilient to future disruption. The third component is what I would call financial sufficiency planning. And that means, as all the finance people on this call will know, understanding that we actually have the capability to financially deliver on our emerging plan, our emergence plan. And that involves looking at our existing cash resources, what we think will be the revenue generation from our updated strategy. Do we have access to appropriate financial facilities to support these transitional periods? And also not forgetting that emergence from COVID will itself create expenses, and we need to be able to factor those expenses in as well. The fourth piece in the Envisage jigsaw, which I think is very, very important indeed, is what I call workplace operating design. We've seen the workplaces change dramatically over COVID. We've had to work from home, many of us. So does that mean that when this finishes, we'll all rush back to the office? Probably not. We're already seeing here in the UK firms like JP Morgan suggesting that they're going to slash their office space needs in the future by 50%. Not because they're going to slash their workforce by 50%, but because they're going to operate in a different way. They're not necessarily going to assume that people are going to come back to the office in the future, or certainly not in the numbers that they were in the past. So in workplace operating design, we think about all these issues like configuration planning, health, etc. And we'll talk about all of these in more detail in the next few slides. So basically, the four macro steps of Envisage that I think you can start thinking about today as you plan your emergence from COVID are business strategy recalibration, business continuity planning, financial sufficiency planning, and workplace operating design. Now, let's take a little bit of time to examine those in more detail. First of all, step one, business strategy recalibration. As I was saying on the previous slide, our current strategy, or rather our historic strategy, we can't assume that that is going to stand up in the future. We need to revisit it. So we need to reassess our existing strategy, and that's not about curtailing our ambition necessarily or cutting back on our expectation of size or growth. It is about reassessing it critically in terms of how we see the future in a post-COVID world. And part of that may be our ability to identify new market opportunities. What has this pandemic shown us about the opportunity for creating new markets? How are people living differently? How are people conducting their lives? And what market opportunities does that present with us? So we need to bring a lot of innovation into the new strategy process. We certainly need to look to accelerate things like digitization and other technology pathways, because clearly these are the future. We were on those journeys anyway, but for many of us, we weren't pushing those journeys digitization. We have to accelerate big data. We have to accelerate artificial intelligence and understand how these can help us transform our strategic approach. For those of you that use techniques like balanced score, and I've been a great fan and advocate of balanced scorecard over the years. For those who use things like strategy maps, you should be updating those now for the new normal. And another component which I think is critical when you do this strategy overhaul is look at the impact of that strategy in terms of the future that you will need to execute the strategy and whether that future workforce will need a different set of skills to the previous workforce. So there's a lot of recalibration of skills here, and this is something I'll talk about in a few minutes. This whole exercise of Envisage requires not just the CEO and a couple of strategic planners, but it requires a broad spectrum of people from the organization, including human resource specialists, including finance specialists, including operations specialists, to be working together to map out this new model. Because the first step is to say, what size workforce are we going to need in the future? Is it smaller? Is it larger? And what is the mix of skills that that workforce will have? Because if we're going to leverage technology in a new way going forward in our strategic plan, we may not have the right balance of skills in our organization today. So we better understand what those future skill requirements are. So that's step one, business strategy recalibration. Step two, business continuity planning. This is where we need to focus a lot more on strategic risk assessment. When we develop our strategy plan, we need to do a formal strategic risk assessment on that plan and say, where are the potential exposures in that plan from a risk point of view? And what risk mitigation strategies are we going to put in place to try and protect ourselves should any of those risks materialize. So we don't have the time to talk about the detail of risk management approaches in this webinar, but certainly I think that for many organizations, you need to beef up your risk management approaches. And that also comes down to business modeling as well. In our business models, if you use a formal business model, where are the issues that could impact business continuity? Do you have just-in-time operations? Because we've all worked to be leaner, more cost-effective over the years, but as soon as there's a disruption, maybe to parts of our supply chain, we can find that our whole business has to close down overnight. So now maybe we need to build what I would call more redundancy into our business models. Maybe not think about eliminating every cost to be as lean as possible, but actually to think about what level of redundancy do we need to ensure that if the worst happens, we can continue to operate. Utilities have done this for years. Companies like Tata Power, etc., in India, they don't build a network that only has a connection between point A and point B. They build a network that has resilience, so that if that line goes down between point A and point B, they can get the electricity around some other route in the network. And that network resilience is something that utility companies understand very well. We need to think about that same sort of resilience in our business planning and business modeling going forward to make sure that we have more than one way to deliver ultimately to our customers. So that's business continuity planning. Let's go on to financial sufficiency planning. This is about understanding whether we can afford this whole process. How will we make money? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're there to do. So what cash do we have access to? What does this new strategy mean in terms of predicted revenue generated cash? What cash will we generate in the future? Do we have financial facilities that can support us during some of the cash flow peaks and troughs of this emergence strategy? And what are the emergence expenses that we're likely to incur? Because we're going to have to invest to make some of these changes to change our business model going forward to the future. So what are the costs? And let's make sure we can actually properly fund this. So finance guys have a big role to play here in underpinning our whole emergence strategy. And finally, and very significantly, this area of workplace operating design. So what is the workplace of the future going to look like? Are we going to be in offices? Are we going to be remote? Is it going to be some hybrid model? What does that actually mean in terms of our need for physical office space? How are we going to structure that mode of working? And in line with this, we need to start thinking also, if we're going to be working increasingly remotely from formal offices, what are the health and well-being strategies and mechanisms that we need to put in place for our employees? Some employees will welcome the ability to work from home. Others will find it very difficult, find they're feeling very isolated. We need to have formal strategies developed as part of our emergence from COVID to make sure that we're looking after the health of our employees and the well-being in both physical and mental health. We also need to revamp our governance processes. Despite all the good words that we've muttered over the years, many of our organizations still work on a very traditional command and control structure. You know, do we really trust our employees to work remotely? Well, I think we should, because I think the majority of employees So what does that mean in terms of governance processes? If we're not going to be clocking these people in and out of the office every day, can we actually give them more freedom? Can we actually work on outcomes rather than measuring outputs? It has an impact on our employee performance management systems. We need to think about moving increasingly to what we call self-managing teams. All of this, I think, can change the dynamic of the workforce and actually change the culture of the workforce so that we now trust and invest in our employees. But this means also focusing on improving employee communications. Our employees are going to be working remotely, so we have to find ways now to communicate to them on a regular basis about what the company's doing, what the plans are, When we've got them in an office, it's fairly easy to do this, although I have to say, not always been well done in the past. But if these employees are going to be increasingly working remotely, how are we going to keep them in the loop? How are we going to keep them informed? How are we going to keep them engaged? How are we going to keep relationships? And finally, all of this puts a demand on changes for technology. Remote working, we need the technologies. Not everybody has great internet connections. Not everybody has technology at home. How are we going to support these people? And how are we going to support security of remote working? We're in a world where there are very sophisticated cyber criminals around. And in our offices, we're able to build firewalls and all these other good things that help protect our data. Well, if we're working in an increasingly remote and evolved environment, what are the implications for protecting that data, which might now not be in the same sort of secure networks that we can maintain within our office environment? All of these are things that have to be thought of through workplace operating design. So fundamentally, we have to put those four components together and actually work to create a plan to emerge. But as we know, a plan is only as good as our abilities to implement it. So the third stage of my survive, envisage, transition model is transition. And that's actually essentially implementing that plan. And there's some things we need to think about as we implement that plan. How are we going to do it? Well, first of all, I think we need to vest the responsibility for that, implementing that plan at a very, very high level. Certainly needs to be a minimum of the COO, I think, in most organizations, who's at the helm of managing this plan. We absolutely need to establish or reinforce our project management office capabilities within the organization. And we need to create a seconded multidisciplinary team. We need strategy specialists. We need human resource specialists. We need finance specialists. We need risk management specialists, just to name a few. And this has to be put together not in just an ad hoc way, but as a formal plan. We want to emerge strong. We want to emerge as a winner. And so we need to create an environment where we really have a physical war room, an office where these people are working, where the whole plan comes together, where we can monitor and report on the progress of the plan. And obviously, potentially, we need to consider the role for external expertise, perhaps, to support us through various components of this plan. So fundamentally, the third stage transition is all about turning into a result for our organization. So that's pretty much the framework that I wanted to introduce to you. And obviously, over a fairly short period of time, it's a fairly high level presentation. But I think emerging as a winner into the new normal is really our goal now. And as I said at various stages through this session, we won't do that by just adopting a survival strategy and waiting for yesterday to re-emerge, because I don't believe that yesterday is going to re-emerge for most of our organizations. What we're going to emerge into is a new world shaped by COVID, the ongoing recurrences, and also a new world that COVID has really given us an opportunity to create, to perhaps fix some of the problems of the old world by delivering to us such a seismic shock that now we can actually take this opportunity to craft something for the future that is better than we had in the past, rather than just responding and wondering how we can get through. So I would encourage you to think about this model, about the survive, envisage, and transition model. Particularly look at those four stages of envisage, where we look at strategy recalibration, where we look at risk management, where we look at financial sufficiency planning, where we look at workplace operating design, and come up with a model for your business, move it into transition, implement it effectively so that you become one of the winners in the new normal economy. Thank you now, and if there are any questions or observations, I'd be delighted to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nigel, for such a fantastic, discussion. I really enjoyed listening to you, and I hope our viewers also enjoyed, hearing your thoughts about the SET model, that essentially, abbreviated SET model. A couple of questions here. I think one of the questions is from Siddharth, who's, when you were talking about the remote working culture, he's asking that is the remote working culture
Yes.
to stay after the COVID-19 pandemic ends, and how to keep productivity levels high in such a scenario. So it'll be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you for it. I do believe that it will stay after COVID ends. I think actually there are a couple of elements to your question. First of all, I think the remote working culture can actually be a positive improvement in all of our working lives. We've all spent years on those commutes, and I've been in Mumbai traffic on many, many occasions and taken 2 hours to get across the city. And the consequence of that is we've spent a huge amount of wasted time, often commuting to and from work to the detriment of our family, etc. Now, working from home allows us to redress some of those problems. But your real point, which is absolutely spot on, how do we ensure productivity? Well, I think what we need to do is we need to look at our employee performance management frameworks, and we need to move increasingly from what I would call outputs to outcomes. So ideally, what we need to do is we need to create teams. People generally work in teams rather than as individuals. We want them to work in teams. We need to give those teams the clear expectation of what has to be delivered, the outcome, and then give them increasing responsibility on being able to deliver it. Now, we always hear the question saying, oh, yes, but what if one or two people are not performing? Well, that isn't the issue for not doing remote working or not managing outcomes. I think actually when people work in self-managed teams, there is a pressure amongst the colleagues in the teams to actually force those people who maybe aren't contributing to contribute better. And it's a bit like in the army. I've done a lot of consulting work for armed forces around the world. It's not actually the officer giving the order that is the main driver of what is achieved. It's the actual platoon of soldiers who put pressure on their colleagues. If one colleague has a disciplinary issue, the whole platoon usually is punished. So this is a question of moving to a more what I would call intelligent working way, where we establish outcomes, not outputs, where we're more focused on what people have to achieve, not on the fact that they spent 8 hours or 9 hours in the office. It's not about numbers, it's about outcomes. So I think we can move towards this environment. I think we should move towards this environment. I think it will create a far better culture in our organizations if people are motivated to deliver. We have to deal with the small percentage of people who will abuse that, but I don't think we should penalize the majority because of the small percentage who may actually see it as a way of doing very little. So that's my sort of thoughts. HR people will need to get very heavily involved in new ways of assessing employee performance based on outcomes, not just outputs.
So fantastic thoughts there. I have another question, and this one is coming from Suman, and Suman is asking that how are the team dynamics changing? I mean, he writes that due to remote working, there are problems arising due to accountability issues, and it is extremely difficult to observe your team working in front of you. So, how to effectively manage teams, and how are team dynamics changing during current times? So, your thoughts on that?
Yes, how to manage teams, and I think we're still learning this. All right, I know that my daughter, who works for one of the main universities in London, she's been on remote working for about 4 or 5 months now, and will probably continue that way for at least till the end of this year and probably well into next year. So to encourage that, what some organizations are doing, they're setting up almost like informal virtual coffee meetings, virtual coffee morning sessions. So they're not just focusing on connection when there's a need to talk about a work issue or where there's a need to have a meeting. They're actually creating almost a virtual environment in which people can drop in. They actually call them drop-in sessions. So, at 11 o'clock, maybe you can drop in to a virtual coffee, just as if you were going to the coffee machine in your office and sitting and having a chat with with your colleagues. So I think we're learning. I think we will continue to learn. I think we've got a lot to try and put together to make it actually work. But I am seeing a lot of evidence of organizations who are creating both a social and work network for their remote employees.
That's actually the way to go about by creating the about by engaging employees socially as well. So that's indeed a good advice indeed. And speaking of good advice, I think I'll take just one last question before I let you go. This question,
Sure.
I unfortunately do not have the name of the person who's written this question. So, but the person asks that, do you have any advice for startups on surviving the current crisis? I mean, that's a very popular question. I must say, because startups probably are one of the worst hit businesses due to owing to their smaller team size, owing to the availability of resources, availability of capital immediately for to to engage in their business.
Yes.
So, your advice on the same, please.
Yes, very good question again. Startups are a difficult challenge, obviously. I mean, one of the things that any startup suffers with is capital and availability of capital. And there's no easy way around that. If capital is not there, it's very difficult to sustain the business through that period. And of course, many startups fail. I'm not necessarily sure that COVID is going to make that substantially worse. What I would say is, in some senses, startups have a bit of an advantage over traditional firms. It's a lot easier to craft a business model when you're a startup than it is to change an existing business model that may have been in place for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So my only advice to startups would be, yes, you have to make sure, obviously, that you can secure capital. That's a given, and there's no easy answer to that. But make sure that if you are a startup, that you are looking at the ways to leverage technology to the maximum effect. Think about your customer base, and also think about whether some of the potential competitors in your industry, the old guys who've been around for a while, whether they are struggling, and can you do something new and different? Just a very simple way. This isn't a startup, but in the UK, I always do my shopping with my wife, my food shopping in large grocery stores. When this happened, they weren't accessible. We couldn't get to them. They were running out of food. Local little provider down the road started providing a fantastic delivery service to the door of all the essentials we needed. And we've kept with that guy now. So what I think you can do is, I think startups have the ability to be a lot more agile. We constantly use this agile word. Startups can be a lot more agile. And so in some senses, you might actually be better off as a startup than one of the big guys who's trying to have to recreate a business model that's been established for 20 plus years.
Absolutely. I mean, technology is certainly the buzzword here, and adoption of technology and bringing innovation certainly does help. So that was the session for today, featuring Mr. Nigel Penny, and thank you so much everyone for joining us. I hope you benefited from this session. If you missed anything, this session will shortly be also available on YouTube for your viewing. And thank you so much, Mr. Penny, for your valuable time. And it was a
My
pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you so much, and have a fantastic day ahead. Thank you.